evening, everyone, and thank you, Professor Basu, for that very, very kind introduction. It's a great honor and privilege to be asked to deliver one of the Pandit Hridaynath Kunjru Memorial Lectures, and it's happy to be among familiar faces. So you'll hear me say much of what I've been saying to you all these years. So I apologize for that in advance. And the other apology that I usually issue is that even I am not very certain where I'm headed in my talks. So if you are not certain, and if you don't know where I'm headed, please don't worry. Hopefully there'll be, at the end, some way that we can put all that I have to say together. The theme I sort of chose for this evening, as you know, as Professor Basu announced, is doing international economic law as if people matter. Can you all hear me? Yeah. The first thing I need to sort of clarify is the scope of international economic law that I have in mind. By international economic law, I mean all the rules governing international investment, international trade, international services, international banking and finance, and of course international intellectual property rights law. I also include within the ambit of international economic law the work of international economic institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and of course the WTO. You will not have failed to notice that international economic law and international economic institutions, it is so defined, covers crucial, very critical aspects of what we call sovereign economic space. That is, these international economic laws pertain to very core dimensions of the exercise of sovereign economic power. So the question that I, to begin with, posed is to myself is that why is it not entirely clear to people or to those who do international economic law, those who study international economic law, those who are in some way engaged in with the world of international economic law and institutions, institutions that they have an enormous impact on the lives of ordinary people. For example, today the fact that a family cannot make two ends meet, or that a worker is retrenched, or an individual is unable to access a life-saving drug, or the life world of a local community is disrupted, often is due to the workings of international economic laws. Yet there seems to be very, very little understanding of the relationship of international economic law and the workings of and the impact on people. The second thing that I wish to note was, as to why, these are reasons for why I picked up this theme was that international economic law no longer simply impacts the material lives of people. So it does impact the material lives of people to the extent, as said, that it has implications for local communities, for individuals, etc. But it also affects what I call the meaning of good life through facilitating and promoting the movements of goods, capital, and services in the world economy. International economic law, as we understand, has promoted a life which is associated with consumer culture, and where an individual's life journey is judged by what he or she consumes or owns. This again is an impact that increasingly international economic law is having. So it's not simply about bread and butter issues, it's also about what the meaning of your life is. It is being, in a sense, redefined by international economic law and institutions. The third reason for picking up this subject of trying to do international economic law as if people mattered is that most of our social movements today, our contemporary social movements, are in the domain of or in areas which have directly sort of implicated with international economic law. So whether it's dams, whether it's mining ventures, whether it's operation of transnational corporations, whether it's the conditionalities of the impact of conditionalities of the financial institution, whether it's free trade agreements, all these areas which have an impact on our lives and where NGOs and social movements are extremely active, have to deal with, in some senses, the world of international economic law. And the sort of most crucial question to me was, how is it that the relationship of international economic law and people and its impact on the lives of people is veiled or mystified or concealed? Because to my mind, anybody who looks at any of the international economic, the working of any of the international economic institutions, any of the international economic laws, would readily understand that this has this very, very intrusive impact on national economies and through them on the lives of ordinary individuals. Yet this doesn't seem to be very clear to our policy makers, and often to social movements and the academia, I'm afraid, I must add. So the principal argument that I wish to make is that there is an urgent need for demystifying or unmasking the inequitable or the unjust nature of international economic laws. And I think that is one of the principal tasks, especially of those of us who are in the academia. We are colleagues in the academia, and I think it's our principal task to ensure that we are able to understand the ways in which the relationship between the international economic law institutions and the lives of ordinary people has been, in a sense, disengaged and has been snapped in the way that they are, in the way that that discourse is being portrayed both within academic work as well as in the popular media. And since I feel that is one of our principal tasks, I thought I'll sort of try and address some of the reasons, which I don't know, I just put a few reasons together, which does not enable us to see the connection between the working of economic laws, institutions, and the lives of ordinary peoples. So in order to do so, I proceed in the following way. I'll first take two examples of decisions in the area of intellectual property rights. I think all of you have read about them in the last week or in the last 3 months. I'll take two examples to show what the serious impact it has on the lives of ordinary citizens. I'll then identify some of the techniques or methods, and that's important, some of the techniques or methods that lead to citizens being treated as objects of international economic law, and the inability sometimes of the academia as well as of social movements to be able to deconstruct or to demystify these international economic law and institutions and establish their relationship with ordinary lives. I'll thereafter try and see how, just with one or two further examples, how this disassociation between international economic laws, institutions, and ordinary lives has led to the lopsided development of international economic law with obvious consequences. I'll then offer some suggestions as to the theoretical and practical steps that can be taken, which are all very routine, to bring about what I call a people's-friendly international economic law. So let me sum up what I'm trying to say, not very well, is that I think we need to address this theme of this theme of doing international economic law as if people mattered, because although the relationship is in a sense obvious, yet that relationship does not emerge within academic literature. It does not seem obvious to policymakers, and it is often not very obvious to social movements, as well. And we are trying to identify the reasons why this is so. Why is it not very, what seems very obvious to some does not seem very obvious to others. So let me begin with the two recent examples where clearly the impact of international economic law on the lives of ordinary peoples is very, very obvious, is very stark. And the examples that I want to take are from the world of international intellectual property rights law. And these are two decisions, very interestingly, which have been handed down by two judicial institutions in this country. One, of course, a decision handed down by the highest court of the land last week in what is known as the Novartis case. But much less celebrated, I think, but which needs to be even more celebrated, is the decision of a much lesser judicial body, or a quasi-judicial body, which is the Controller General of Patents, Mumbai's decision Mumbai's decision in a case which is known as the Bayer case, which decision has been now upheld by the appellate body, which is known as the Intellectual Property Rights Appellate Body. Now let's just simply look at in just two sentences each, the facts of these two cases. In the Bayer case, in the Bayer case, a local company known as NATCO was seeking a compulsory license, from the German pharmaceutical giant, the Bayer company. And it was seeking a compulsory license on several grounds, including its non-accessibility to the people of this country because of the pricing policies that were being followed by Bayer. And the drug in issue was a drug which is an anti-cancer drug called Nexavar. Now, at the end of the day, I don't want to get into the details. At the end of the day, the Controller General of Patents Mumbai, handed down an order issuing a compulsory license in favor of the company NATCO. Now, the reasons for it doing so were several, but one of the reasons was that the company which was manufacturing this drug was selling it at a price which made it certain that ordinary people, including our middle classes, could not make use of this drug in the fight against cancer. And the figures are rather astonishing. If I'm not wrong, and I would ask there are friends here who know this better, that Bayer was charging for this drug the price of 2,80,000 a month for the consumption of this one drug for a period of 1 month, was costing one patient 2,80,000 a month. And the issuance of this license to the local company, to the national company NATCO, meant that the price of this drug would plumb from 2,80,000 a month to rupees 8,000 a month. That is to less than 3 to 5% of the price of the drug at which it was being sold. In the second case, which has been just decided by the Supreme Court, which is known as the Novartis case, which all of you probably, on which we've had a lot of op-eds in the national dailies, a lot of debate also in the electronic media. The Supreme Court has stopped one of the pharma giants, Novartis, from what we call evergreening a patent, that it already had a patent, and the patent was on the drug. The brand name of the drug is Glivec. The chemical name is imatinib mesylate. And what Novartis was trying to do was trying to get a new patent on the same drug by making very marginal, in popular language, by making certain very, very marginal changes to the drug. Now, again, the pricing here is the pricing of the drug, if it is sold as a branded drug, in contrast to if it is sold as what is called a generic drug, is very, very stark. The tablet Glivec was being sold, from what I gather from the newspapers, at rupees 4,115 per tablet, in contrast to the price of rupees 30 for the generic generic drug. So the contrast between the what you would pay for the consumption of the branded drug Glivec and the generic drug, if Novartis was not allowed to evergreen this patent, is again very, very stark. And the issue, the decision revolved around one little section called Section 3D of the Indian Patents Act, which required that if Novartis was to get this patent on a variation of the drug Glivec, then it had to show that there was enhanced therapeutic efficacy, with the production or consumption of this new drug. Novartis was unable to show to the Honorable Supreme Court that through this, by using compounds which made this particular chemical more soluble, more easily digestible, that it anyway was contributing to enhancing the therapeutic efficacy of the drug. So the Supreme Court actually turned down the petition of Novartis, and Novartis has gone through a chain of courts. It went first to the Controller of Patents, then to the appellate body, then to the Madras High Court, and through that finally to the Indian Supreme Court. And each time its application was turned down. Now, if you look at these two cases, then the contrast in the prices itself will tell you that something is wrong with the international intellectual property rights law. Now, why do I say that? We all know, or we should know at least, that every country in the world has to have the same minimum standards so far as intellectual property rights are concerned, if it is a member of the WTO. So every member of the WTO has to abide by certain, comply with certain minimum standards, which are incorporated into what is known as the TRIPS text, or the Agreement on Trade-related Intellectual Property Rights. And once you have incorporated those, minimum standards, the understanding of these pharma companies was that the kind of moves that they were making, the kind of petitions they were advancing, would be the kind of aspirations that they have would be accepted by policymakers, by judicial institutions. Now, two things that I want to mention here before I move forward. One thing, that we need to thank the left in this country for introducing this Article 3D. This Article 3D, that you will not get another patent, an already patented drug, unless you can show an enhanced therapeutic efficacy, was introduced almost at the last moment, thankfully, by the Indian Parliament, and that accounts for the fact that Novartis could not get a new patent on an old drug. The other point that I wish to make, and which I've been thinking about and reflecting for the last 2 or 3 months, ever since the Bayer judgment, the Bayer order was handed down by the controller of patents, and that was this. Since about 1989, if I remember correctly, I have been part of a group which is called the National Working Group on Patent Laws. And this group started to function even before the WTO came into existence, and when and the WTO agreements were adopted, of which the TRIPS text is one of them. And since 89-90, we have been arguing in a variety of forums with parliamentarians, with bureaucrats, with all kinds of policy makers, that please try and see that you get a different intellectual property rights text, that are different TRIPS text than we did have eventually. But we could not persuade them. We could not persuade them for about two and a half decades. This is between about 89-90 and till very recently, till these two decisions have come, that this intellectual property rights regime has very, very grave implications for ordinary people, especially so far as the right to health is concerned, their access to life-saving drugs is concerned. We were always told, we were given a variety of answers. One, of course, was that WTO is a package deal, we lose some. Those who even accepted our arguments, we lose some, we gain some. But most of the time we were also told that actually you do not realize by having what we call a hard or a strong intellectual property rights regime, we are going to promote growth, we are going to promote development, we are going to make sure that foreign direct investment comes into this country, we are going to ensure that the transfer of technology takes place. And these are precisely the arguments that Novartis and its spokespersons are giving even today, that if you do this, innovation won't happen, we are not going to bring capital into this, the pharma companies are not going to bring capital into the countries, and which means it will slow down your economies. And then I try to think about the possible reasons, and these are elementary reasons. I try to think about the possible reasons why, for this quarter of a century, all these people, very competent, very bright, very sort of understanding of the relationship between economics and politics, the relationship between economics and what it means for ordinary peoples, could not understand the implications of the international intellectual property rights law. And it's not simply about international intellectual property law. Why can't they understand, for example, the reasons similarly as to why the conditionalities of the international financial institutions likewise have a very deleterious effect on on ordinary citizens. Likewise, why can't they understand that international investment laws are developing in ways which neglect the concerns of local communities and ordinary people? And I arrived at some 7 or 8 reasons, a few reasons why I felt that they were not able to see a connection that I was able to see, or some other colleagues were able to see. And I think this sort of, what I'm trying to do is trying to say 2 things. One, of course, the importance of demystification and deconstruction of existing international economic laws. The other thing that I'm saying, trying to say is that the way international economic laws are debated, the way they are they're presented to the people, they seem to be able to sort of disconnect, to be able to break for them this relationship between these laws and institutions on one hand, and the impact it has on ordinary people. So what are these different techniques that are used? What are the ways in which this sort of outcome is achieved? And so here are some reasons that I thought of. Because again, if now it's very obvious that Bayer charges 2,80,000 for a drug which can be sold at rupees 10,000. But why was it not so obvious all these years, that this quarter of a century, that the National Working Group on Patent Laws and other groups were saying precisely the same thing? It was not very obvious. And this is just one example. So just keep in mind the broader picture. We are talking of investment laws, we are talking of financial laws, monetary laws, etc., etc. So here are these 8 or 10 reasons that I could think of which results in this outcome. The first is, of course, how the history of international economic institutions and international laws are narrated. So it's very, very interesting. If you pick up a book on international economic relations or on the world economy or international economic law, which is my domain, it's very interesting how that history is presented. So the moment they will start talking about international economic institutions, economic relations, they will always treat this as a post-Second World War phenomenon. At best, they will say, they will go back to the League of Nations period and say that during the League there was the World Economic Conference. In fact, they will say the League was successful only in one sphere, which was the economic sphere, that they were able to bring states together to think about economic problems of our times. And I find this interesting because, to my mind, the history of international economic law goes back centuries, And clearly the whole colonial project was all about international economic relations in a core sense of the term. And international economic laws existed even then. So the reason why they want to narrate the history of these laws and institutions as a post-war phenomenon is precisely that they want to break this relationship between colonialism, between hegemony, between imperialism, and international economic law, contemporary international economic laws, contemporary economic laws and institutions. And the moment you narrate this history differently, the whole evolution and the development of contemporary international economic laws is viewed differently. Let me give you an example from a work that a very good friend has done. So he looked at the entire mandate system under the League of Nations. He looked at the entire mandate system, and he was also looking at the international financial institutions. And this is the work. There are several who contribute. This is the work of international lawyer called Anthony Anghie, who's based in the United States. And he was very struck by the fact how what the mandate system was doing was very, very similar to what the international economic institutions, international economics is. So what were they both doing? I don't want to get into it. Both were talking about the development of these territories. So the mandate system was all about, there was A, B, C mandates, and from C you get to B, from B you get to A. If you were A, then hopefully from infancy or childhood you reach manhood, and then you were declared an independent state. So they were all trying to develop these territories. And the second thing that they were doing is they were both trying to produce enormous amount of knowledge about these territories, about the League territories. And we know that the World Bank does this about, and the IMF does this about the post-colonial countries or the developing countries. I don't know how many of you know that I think the World Bank Development Report, the initial number of copies printed are more than 5,000, which is more than, unless you're Amartya Sen or Stiglitz, I don't think that is the kind of number that printers publish. So the short point I'm trying to make is that if you look at this history, then there are clear parallels between what the financial institutions are doing and what economic institutions or political institutions were doing. In this case, the parallel is between the mandate system and the work of the international financial institutions. There's a very, very clear parallel. And by narrating this history differently, they want to suggest that colonialism is something of the past. We don't need to discuss it. So there's a clear break with the Second World War, and with that rupture, now there are new institutions in place which are genuinely trying to promote development in third world countries or development in the developing world. So this is one way they obscure, the relationship between economic laws, institutions. They're working with the impact they have on ordinary lives. In fact, they reverse the relationship by saying, no, it's all about you. In the past, it was all about colonization, domination, hegemony, etc. But now it's all about you. The second way, and I don't want to dwell on this, is this is something which is within the domain of international law, the continuing use of what we call the formalist or positivist method. This is and positivism is celebrated within the domain of international economic law, which means, as one of the sort of leading theorists of the 20th century, Hans Kelsen, said, the need to avoid what he called methodological syncretism. That is, the point he was doing is that we should eschew, we should not do interdisciplinary analysis, and that lawyers should look at law and look at rules, likewise sociologists should look at their domain area and economists should look at their domain area. So by using the positivist method, what lawyers do is they confine themselves to simply the interpretation and application of rules. And so the world of consequences is completely left out. So, so that again you don't have to neither talk about it nor assume responsibility for the kind of work you do. So if you're looking at the international financial institutions and the mandate, you'll confine yourself to their legal interpretation of the mandate. You'll be less concerned about what the conditionalities of these financial institutions means for the lives of ordinary people. A third reason, and these are reasons that I've just been thinking over. I don't know if they're valid, legitimate or not. We could have a discussion on. A third reason for being able to de-link economic laws, institutions from peoples is the embrace of the neoclassical emphasis on growth. Now this critique of this idea is becoming increasingly more acceptable. So development for all these last decades has been associated, we know, with growth. So even today when our Prime Minister speaks, it's always about 6.6%, 6.2%. Next day somebody will say 5.3%, the other day will say 7%. There'll be other agencies which will tell you so many percent. By the end of the day, people like us don't know, don't care. There's some percentage of growth. But always it is the vocabulary of growth rates. Now, in contrast to this, we know the critique of equating development with growth. The best critique for this has been provided by Professor Amartya Sen in his sort of well-celebrated book, Development as Freedom. And he's insistently repeating, each time he comes to India, he's saying the same thing. Please don't equate development with growth. If it has to mean real development of people, it must enhance the capabilities and entitlements of people. Development is all about what people can do with capabilities and rights to change their lives. It is about empowering. It is about empowering them. So what he has been doing, trying to do along with this celebrated colleague from Pakistan, Mehboob ul Haq, is trying to move the discourse from the neoclassical emphasis on growth to the whole idea of development as freedom. And if you view even say, this narrow issue of intellectual property rights from that point of view, then you would have perhaps understood even 2 decades ago that if you look at it sheerly from the growth point of view, then you are talking about how much investment the Novartis will do, how much investment the German giant Bayer would do, and then it would produce growth, and then there would be a trickle-down effect, or there would be some redistributive policies. And therefore you tend to embrace that world, these set of ideas. But if you had viewed it as development as freedom, then you would have talked about right to health of ordinary people, their entitlements. You would also, of course, had to talk about a whole range of other things, right to education, etc., to enhance the capabilities of ordinary individuals. So what I'm trying to briefly say through all this is that ideas matter, categories matter, ideologies matter, and they make all the difference in terms of how we view the world, and especially the world that I'm talking about, international economic laws and institutions. Fourth, I found it very, very interesting. If you pick up any book on international economic relations or on international economic law, you can have your pick. You will rarely find a chapter on labor. So one of the oldest agencies in the world, the oldest international institutions in the world we know is the International Labour Organization. It has rendered human service in terms of adopting dozens and dozens of conventions and declarations, etc., in order to strengthen the rights of the working class. And it has also adopted a huge number of conventions in different sectors, indigenous peoples, it has, women's rights, eliminating child labor, etc., etc. Yet you will not find much in these textbooks about the working class. It is as if the wealth is produced on its own, wealth is generated on its own. And that international economic relations also happens on its own. Somebody produces this goods, somebody produces these services, they come into the market, and let's now talk only about liberalization, about how markets should be working. I'll go through quickly because I think I'm running short of time. So fifth reason that I would like to offer to you, which enables this rupture between the relationship that I've been talking about, is the mandate or the divide between economic and politics, which is written into the mandate and the charters of the international financial institutions. And this is again very interesting. And when the United Nations was adopted, the UN Charter was adopted, we know that there was, and I'll come to this later, we know there was a body which was assigned the task of international coordination in economic sphere, which was the Economic and Social Council, and that the ECOSOC was supposed to promote development objectives. At the same time, it established specialized agencies, of which two of which were the financial institutions. But it's very interesting that if you look at the mandate of the financial institutions, the mandate precisely breaks this connection between the UN as a project for promoting development and the policies of the financial institution. It does so by saying, and this is written into the charters of these financial institutions. For example, Article 10 of the Articles of Agreement of the World Bank or the IBRD clearly states that the World Bank cannot take into account political factors in its decision making. It must only take into account purely economic criteria in determining whether it wants to give a loan or not, etc. Now, what it successfully does again by doing so is, in a sense, it keeps politics out, which we need not critique. That is, policy out in terms of determining whom to give a loan to. You are not going to decide this on basis of political factors, but on the basis of economic criteria. But what it simultaneously succeeds in doing is to keeping out the consequences of its policies as well. That is, at the level of outcomes also, it clearly sort of breaks the relationship between economics and politics, so that no longer the financial institution need to be concerned with what happens once its conditionalities are implemented. And technically speaking, both the financial institutions say, and this is again very interesting, that they are not bound by international human rights law. Both say that they haven't signed on to these conventions, the state may have signed on to these conventions, so they are not bound by international human rights law, so they don't have to worry about whether these are being violated. In fact, the only concession they give is that they are bound by the decisions of the UN Security Council. So again, because of the way the mandate itself is being constructed, it does not allow you to link the world of economics with the world of politics and with the world of the ordinary lives of people. A sixth reason, or whatever the number be, that most of the trade agreements, and and if you look at the trade agreements, especially the WTO agreements, they only deal with producers' rights. And this I talk to my students all the time. So if you look at any textbook on the WTO or any textbook on WTO law, you will find that the only perspective that you will get, the only way international agreements are read and interpreted is through the prism of producers' concerns, through producers' rights. So that one leading sort of mainstream international economic law scholar, very mainstream, has said that he went through 30,000 pages of WTO law, which includes all the tariff schedules, etc., and did not find a single word about consumers' rights. It's all about producers. It is all about producers. It's all about producers' rights. And he then says, therefore, that ordinary citizens are merely objects of international economic law. The real subjects are the firms and those who, the producers, as if it were, who derive all the benefits from the operation of these laws. So again, let me remind you, what I'm saying is that the methodology which is used in terms of negotiating, adopting, interpreting international economic laws and institutions is such that it does not allow you to see, you have to demystify it in order to see the connection between them and what happens to ordinary people. Let me just mention another 2 or 3 reasons. I'll stop. I've got a whole chain of reasons with me why what seems obvious to me doesn't seem obvious to others. The other thing that happens in mainstream scholarship, both in international economic relations as well as in law, is that resistance is not taken seriously. So no amount of resistance can ever enter a normal article written in an international relations journal or international law journal or a mainstream law journal. Let me give you an example. For the last 25 years, we have been struggling in whatever little ways of trying to change the intellectual property rights laws in this country. And this, as I said, has been going on since 1988. And there are several organizations, the civil society organization, engaged with this. You read any article, any textbook on intellectual property rights laws, and this is not just an Indian phenomenon, this is a global phenomenon. You will not find a single sentence about this. So it will be all about the case law, what the rules are, what the case law is, how it's been interpreted by this court, how it's been interpreted by that court, and the alternative possible interpretations. But none of them will tell you that there are thousands and thousands of people out there who are marching on the roads, who are opposing this law because this impinges on their world, because this impinges on their life. They often do not want to make this connect in the name of academic rigor. That's all about bad politics. That's all about politics. What we as academics are doing, we need to look at, we need to do rigorous analysis. We need to simply look at, the more academic, as if it were more professional materials, and then arrive at a judgment. The result is that once this narrative of resistance is not an integral part of the story of a particular institution. So why is it that you read about the financial institutions in textbooks, that you don't find any mention of movements all over the world against these financial institutions? You will have to read a separate article. You will definitely find several essays which only talk about movements against the financial institutions. But in the mainstream textbooks, you will never find a mention of these movements. They would discuss these institutions as if nothing is happening, on the ground. A last one, since I think I'm exceeding my time. A last one is the approach of the post-colonial state itself. And if you look at the literature on international law, it's a fascinating story. It's a fascinating story, and let me tell you this story in just a couple of sentences. That is, in the immediate aftermath of the decolonization process in the in the late 50s, as the decolonization process was gaining ground, and in the very early 60s, the developing countries were very active within the UN forums, trying to adopt several resolutions which talked about the rights of the peoples of the former colonial world. And one of these resolutions that is talked about a lot in international law literature is a famous resolution adopted in 1962 called the Resolution on Permanent Sovereignty over Natural Resources. And this was all about the post-colonial state reclaiming natural resources. Here stood for everything economic, reclaiming that to itself, and then using it for the using it to advance the welfare of its people. This happens in 62. By 74, what happens? In 74, we are supposed to have adopted the most radical of resolutions, the most radical of programs that have ever been adopted within the international system. This was the resolution on the new international economic order. And this was supposed to be a very revolutionary at that point of time, a path-breaking resolution. Yet if you read the resolution very closely, you will see that everywhere the word peoples was used in the earlier resolution has been substituted by the word state. And most governments were very, very unhappy and uneasy with the fact that sovereignty over our resources rested with the people. And they felt uneasy, although this did not translate into any real serious remedy within the international domain. It's not that you could go somewhere and say, since it's our sovereignty, the state can't do this. But they understood the subversive nature of this formulation itself, that if you formulate it in the mode of the sovereignty resting, that is the mineral resources in Chhattisgarh or in Jharkhand, resting with the people and not with the state, it had implications. It had implications that that would have a long-telling effect on at least the ruling elites in this country. And I'm not just speculating. If you read a very recent case, and again a very, very well-celebrated case, because this, which was the Nandini Sundar versus Union of, versus the state of Chhattisgarh and another, which was about Salwa Judum. But where I would recommend to all of you to read this, this is the judgment of the Honorable Supreme Court. They begin by they begin by quoting of all people Joseph Conrad and the Heart of Darkness, which is at the center of the colonial project. And not only they go further and dig out other essays of Conrad's and talk about the colonial exploitation of resources. And then they come, and then there are several passages which go on to suggest, indict the nature of the neoliberalization policies that the Indian state was pursuing. In fact, the government was so upset, they wanted to file a review petition against this. They were told, these judges are still going to be around, so why don't you leave it at that? The point I'm making is exactly what the Honorable Supreme Court made, that the post-colonial state itself has been trying to mystify the nature of economic policies that are being pursued. And this demystification continues today, because we are constantly told that all these growth rates are only for you, the development is only for you, but we know that despite more than a dozen years of growth, 40% of Indian people are still below the poverty line, etc., etc. So what I've done is to just give you some reasons how the mystification process proceeds, how this relationship between these laws and institutions and the lives of ordinary people are disassociated or disconnected, and it's part of the role of academia. Now quickly, what are the consequences of this? I said one consequence is in the domain of IPR law. These consequences can be seen, and I'll just give one example for the shortage of time, in the area of international investment law, to which also the state is now waking up. So if you look at the last 25 years, you will find that there are any number of laws, international laws, which have been adopted to safeguard the interests of the foreign investor. Safeguard the interest of what we call the multinational or the transnational corporations. Let me just count out some of them, so that so that it doesn't remain at the level of rhetoric. So India, in the last about 15 to 20 years, Gopal, we have adopted about 80 bilateral investment protection treaties. We had none. 80 bilateral investment protection treaties and more we may adopt. And these bilateral investment protection treaties are all about giving protection to the foreign investor. The foreign investor often is this poor transnational firm. Then we signed on, of course, to WTO. Within the WTO, there are 2 or 3 agreements which essentially deal with foreign investment laws. One is known as the Agreement on Trade-Related Investment Measures, and the other is known as the General Agreement on Trade in Services. Both of them lay constraints on the state in what policies what policies you can put in place vis-a-vis the foreign investor. To just give you a quick example from the TRIMS text, if today India is inviting a foreign investor, under the TRIMS text, it can no longer advance a condition saying that if you come into India, you must use local products, or what is called the local content requirement. So remember the old Maruti that eventually it was first completely imported from Japan, then we were going to indigenize by using local inputs. But now under the TRIMS text, if you insist that you use local inputs, they will take you to the WTO dispute settlement body, and you will find yourself being ruled against. So these are the 2 agreements within the WTO. Then we are signing a range of free trade agreements. Although these are free trade agreements, a number of these agreements deal with investment clauses. That is, they are again all about enhancing the rights of foreign investors within our economy. And the recent debate that is going on is in relation to the EU, the European Union, India FTA, on which I get about 10 mails a day, and I was telling friends that I hope you send me one email that I can read. But 10 emails a day warning against the disaster that this FTA would mean for the Indian economy, because what they are seeking is higher intellectual property rights regime standards. They are also seeking opening up of our Indian markets, higher compliance standards so far as investment is concerned. India is also a member of what is called as MIGA. I know every year I ask my students, very few have ever heard of this. So how many have heard of MIGA other than my students? Okay, there's some who have, I'm happy somebody's heard of MIGA. So the MIGA is a multilateral investment guarantee agency established by the World Bank, which ensures foreign investors against non-commercial risks. So if there's political instability, if they stop you from repatriating capital, etc., then the MIGA can come into play, subject to a number of preconditions being filled. So I don't want to go on, but there are a large number of international investment agreements that we are party to. And what I wanted to say was, in contrast to this, over the last 4 decades or 5 decades, the developing countries have not been able to successfully adopt one little code of conduct to the peoples of the host states. One big effort was made in the 70s as a part of the NIO. It collapsed by the 90s, that is, as soon as the Cold War ended, it was dead and buried. But such has been the implications of this lopsided regime that again this whole project has been revived. And it's interesting, it is the UN which has again come to the fore in 2011. The UN, of all things, has adopted a set of rules with regard to the duties of transnational corporations. And it is the UN which is pleading now with its countries. The sanitized UN is pleading with the developing countries, please save domestic policy space to take care of the interest of consumers, of ordinary consumers and of ordinary citizens. Now, what can be done about all this? So I wanted to get into financial law because that's the most critical part about how our international financial legal system is being shaped, especially by the United States, so that we may soon have a completely capital convertible regime, which may lead to the kind of crisis that the capital account convertibility regime, which led to the kind of crisis we saw in East Asia in 1997. The US is insisting on this in its own bilateral investment protection treaties and FTAs, but I'm not going there. Let me conclude by saying, what are the things we can do as academics, as those who participate in social movements or are part of civil society organizations? How can we ensure that we do international economic law or study international economic institutions as if people matter? So the first, of course, is that we need to rewrite its history. It's very, very important to have a counter narrative to the existing narrative. We need to make the connection between the present project and the colonial project, and the parallels are clear. This is not a forced enterprise. Anybody who reads about the colonial times and the history of colonial institutions and reads how the key institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and the WTO operate will see clearly the parallel. The second most important thing we need to do is to insist with whoever we meet among the policy makers is that we need to retrieve the policy space that we have lost through the signing of this range of international economic agreements or accepting the policies of a range of international economic institutions. Because what has essentially happened is that the policy space that a state has to shape its own worldview, to shape its own policy instruments, that has been lost. We cannot do X because we have signed on to WTO agreements. We cannot do Y because the World Bank insists that you need to do this if you are going to take development loans for them. But there have to be ways in which we retrieve this. And the story about those two instances of those two decisions on intellectual property rights is actually a story about the retrieval of this policy space. So basically the courts are saying, this may have been done, but we can't allow you to continue to do this. We can't allow you to rip off the Indian people. We can't allow you to make profits which are at the expense of the right to health of the Indian people. So the courts are trying to retrieve as much policy space, but there are limits to what the judiciary can do. They are bound by laws. But our legislatures can be more imaginative, can be more inventive, and can come up with ways of trying to find imaginative ways to retrieve whatever policy space that we can from the existing regimes to which we are voluntarily parties. Likewise, I wanted to talk about retrieving space where international capital account regulations are concerned. I'll only mention that very few months ago, 250 of the top economists of the world, including 30 or 40 of the key economists within the United States, wrote to Hillary Clinton saying, for heaven's sake, make sure that countries have the autonomy and the space to impose capital account regulations. Otherwise, we are going to see disaster after disaster unfold. And several countries have been doing that. I can't get into the details, but countries like Brazil and Thailand, they have put in place capital account regulations. Thankfully, again, thanks to the left, which did not under UPA 1 allow the regime to go completely capital account convertible, we were not so badly damaged after the 2008 financial crisis. So that is another area which requires attention. We of course need to go back to trying to revive the old idea about right to development understood in the Amartya Sen way. We know there has been a declaration on the right to development. Once our colleague in JNU, Professor Arjun Sen Gupta, he was a special rapporteur on this right to development. He did a lot of work on this and trying to find ways as to how to enhance the basic rights of ordinary people, right to health, right to education itself. We also need to revive the major institutions, economic institutions within the UN system, which is ECOSOC on one hand, the United Economic and Social Council, which was supposed to be a centerpiece of coordinating development projects, and also reposition UNCTAD, which is another story. UNCTAD was created as a pro-developing country organization. It's been repositioned, now it's been sanitized, normalized, however you wish to put it, and is now pursuing the agenda of the industrialized world. That area needs to be revisited. We need to go back, we need to sort of modify the decision-making process within the international financial institutions by getting more voting rights, more voting rights for developing country states. We need a code on conduct on transnational corporations, etc. Now, these are by way of a positive agenda of what we ways in which we can intervene both in the academic literature and outside in terms of making international economic law more people's friendly. But the fundamental task, and I'll conclude there, but the fundamental task remains the task of demystification, reconstruction, of trying to show the linkages between existing laws and institutions and their enormous impact on the life of ordinary people, not to be entrapped by categories like growth, not to be enticed by categories like growth in order to neglect again the world of the ordinary world the world of ordinary citizens, and we can see that I personally feel that we can do a lot here because, as I said, ideas matter greatly. Ideas make all the difference in the long run in terms of how both policymakers as well as institutions perceive their role and what they think are good policies. Because eventually if you look at the example of Sen himself, what has he eventually done? Eventually all he has done is he has replaced the word growth with the idea of development as freedom. And that simple shift in categories from simply being focused on growth to be focused on the idea of development defined as enhancement of freedom of capable entitlement has meant a huge difference on how we perceive the existing sort of international economic dispensation. The Human Development Report, that's why, have played a very important role in sensitizing us to the whole range of other variables that need to be kept in mind if we really want to promote the development of people. So, for example, despite all this despite all these what we call growth rates, the latest, there's a report which is going to be released tomorrow, I think. I'm told we are ranked 136th in the in the HDI rankings. So we need to. And the second thing we need to do is, of course, is to try and review all the existing policies, or through movements, through critique, try and get to review all the existing laws and institutions to which we are a party, because that's the only way, as I said, of retrieving policy space. And other countries have already begun. For example, Brazil has undertaken an exercise on bilateral investment protection treaties. It came to a conclusion: we won't sign anymore. Brazil's Lula simply said, no more. We think we are going down the wrong route. Then South Africa recently issued a white paper, and this is just on some instruments in international investment law, did a white paper on bilateral investment protection treaties and came to a similar conclusion that it has led to too much loss of policy space. We need to not go down. Even developed countries like Australia have recently taken a decision that we are going to review our position on bilateral investment protection treaties because it doesn't protect other competing values. Foreign investment is great, but foreign investment not at the expense of X, Y, and Z. And I'm told that after the, this G2, what is it? What is the scam? 2G. The 2G scam and the 3G scam. India also is doing a certain amount of rethinking on these 80 agreements we signed, because under 2D we were going to be taken to arbitration by some of the transnational corporations under these bilateral investment protection treaties. So the short point is that we need to, through these critique and movements, try and reach out. But in order to reach out, we have to do this deconstruction exercise, this demystification exercise, because there are a lot of ways in which, the relationship between these laws, institutions, and the lives of ordinary people are concealed, they are hidden, and we need to bring that to the fore, because often it won't be as stark as it was in the case of intellectual property rights, which is 280,000 on one hand and 10,000 on the other. This would frighten any court. I don't think there will be many courts who will be willing to, go down the 280,000 route. That is to say that if you are going to buy a branded drug, it's going to cost this. If you're buying a generic drug, it's going to cost 8,000. Nobody is going to go down. But other situations may not be as stark. They are much more messy. They are much more complicated. And so they require much more closer scrutiny, much more closer analysis, much more, critical rigor in order to be able to then mobilize people on that basis and try and change them. I'm truly sorry for this absolutely incoherent ramblings, but I just thought I'll share some of my confused thoughts with you. Thank you so much. Helpful, these questions, to make my points clearly. Let me begin with the last. I think this has been endlessly debated, but now there is very, very clear evidence, evidence that you do not require these incentives, even for the pharmaceutical sector to innovate. So there is this great book by two authors called Baldwin and Levine, which is, these are American economists who have written a book which is trying to precisely address this issue, and they come to the conclusion that even the poster boys of patent regimes do not require the kind of incentives that they are seeking through the TRIPS. They are seeking through the TRIPS regime. Secondly, you're entirely correct that a lot of public money goes into R&D, of which these pharma companies are beneficiaries. A third, even the figure that they give that they invest in R&D is, as you have seen in newspapers, grossly exaggerated. They will say $1 billion for a molecule. Actually, most figures will say it is 1/4 of that they spend when they spend, and when it is not public sector, where it's not public money, money that has been invested. Fifth, from one market alone, they recover all their money. So, for example, in the case of Glivec, even if you accept their claim, they spent $1 billion on innovation. They recovered $1.36 to $1.46 billion from the US market alone. And now what we have under the TRIPS regime is one global market for a period of 20 years. Now, even after 20 years, they want to extend the life of this patent through what is the process of evergreening, and which is at the expense of people. So nobody actually is suggesting the radical regime that don't have a patent regime. Nobody is suggesting that any firm should not make a decent amount of profits, but they should not be sharks. They should not be sharks at the expense of people. And the other thing is, other sectors do not require so much. It's only the pharma sector which is invested in, which is invested in this. So there's enormous amount of evidence out there, but they have counter clout. You know, we also know the story of how TRIPS got into WTO is also well known. It's almost like a conspiracy of 12 CEOs of the 12 major pharma companies meeting together, planning it out, getting the US to put it on the agenda of the GATT negotiations, and all, despite all our resistance, you know, they managed to succeed. So that is the response. Now, human security, you know, I agree on both counts. I'm very uncomfortable with this concept of security. But often this is a move, this is a strategic move as if you make. Because if you feel if you add the word security to anything, it will catch the attention of the policy makers. You know, because anything that's security has got to be very, very important in some way to national security as a. Second problem I have, I don't want to get into details, with the human security concept is it neglects all the fractures within society. So it talks as if class doesn't exist, as if race doesn't exist, as if gender doesn't exist, as if caste doesn't exist. So it's a sort of a concept which elites or tides over all these fractures within society and talks of everybody. But it has its uses. Let's grant it has its uses. At least you get some amount of. In some ways, you get the concerns, as we were talking about, ordinary people center stage by using this language of security. So far as the derivative is concerned, I think one interesting story that I think I can share with you is the analysis which Stiglitz and many others have done, including Prabhat Patnaik have done. So they have a very interesting analysis of the financial crisis. And the interesting analysis that Stiglitz and all these, there are several who have done, is that, you know, that the deregulation that took place of international finance within the United States, you know, through the Glass-Steagall Act, that is, the Wall Street was allowed to invent new products. And their argument is that they had no choice but to allow this. Because of two things. One, that there was growing equality within the United States. And the figures, in contrast to Europe, the figures are frightening. So from the top CEO to the bottom, it can be something like 250 to 1. It is a growing equality. And there was enormous capital in the hands of some few, say 1% of the population within the United States. And the financial sector, the whiz kids of Wall Street, what they had to do was they had to keep inventing new products to sell these people, because they had no other place to invest. And the argument is that if they had not done this, then the crisis would have occurred 5 years earlier. So what they successfully did was to postpone the crisis. So the bubble did burst, but the bubble burst 5 or 7 years later. And their argument continues. The importance of their argument is that they say that till this inequality remains, you will not be able to regulate Wall Street. That is why even President Obama has not been able to successfully put in place laws to regulate Wall Street, had to concede. And if you read a recent UNCTAD report, which is now no longer the old UNCTAD, so even they have a surprise tone. It says it's crazy that the same guys who caused the crisis are today telling us what should be the rules, that should regulate international finance. Because the feeling is again that if you have to come out of this crisis, you cannot over-regulate international finance, because it is international finance. So the short point is, in today's world, international finance capital is center stage. It is playing a key role, and we see that even vis-a-vis us. Our ratings are lowered. What is the fear? That all the short-term investment, or the speculative money or hot money as it's called, it will run away. And once it starts running away, then there is a herd mentality. They will all run away and it will bring down. This is what happened in East Asia. So the importance of this story is twofold. One, that in international relations, and I think, again, this is a weak spot in us, Professor Sani was mentioning this yesterday in something we were discussing, is that we don't take international economics seriously. That international finance capital is defining our world today. It moves millions of dollars, billions of dollars of capital from one country to another country at the stroke of a simple tab on your PC. And we don't address this issue. We pretend that the world goes on as before. So the whole issue of derivatives, or the whole range of new financial products that the WizKids produce through mathematical modeling, etc., is simply to find, profits for those who have concentrations of capital. And like I said, people don't appreciate enough that it's thanks to the left preventing UPA 1 from going. There have been reports in this country saying it will be wonderful to go capital account convertible. In contrast to which, those who are serious neoclassical economists, they have always opposed it. And I would recommend to whoever, the few of you are here, a great essay by Jagdish Bhagwati in Foreign Affairs about 15 years ago. He wrote about 4 pages talking about the Wall Street mafia. He called the Wall Street US Treasury mafia. And he warned 15 years ago, please don't go down this road because you're going to confront this crisis. So the serious among them have realized this, and this is something again, how it connects to what I was trying to say very badly, to be honest today, I'll confess that, is that we need to demystify this world. See, if I cannot explain to my students what is this Wall Street, what is this global finance, how does it affect the international system? How can it bring big country to its knees? It has brought big, including the United States. That is what globalization is, that even the most powerful superpower in the world, its president can't do a thing to global finance capital. And so unless we can demystify this and make this sort of accessible, and bring that understanding to bear upon how the global order is shaping, I think at least personally I feel we are not doing sufficient. And that relates exactly to the earlier question that you asked about what the role of academics is. And that is a question again we don't sufficiently debate. What is our role as academics? So what is so we can say it's the pursuit of truth, of speaking truth to power. So what are these? And we need to be clear about this, because often I find that many of us feel that, many of our students feel that it's more about advising the prince. It's more about telling the prince what he should do, rather than about trying to demystify the existing demystify global order, and being able, like I said, to speak truth to power by saying that these are not things, which also means often marginalization, which also means for social movements enormous amount of patience. So the person who led the National Working Group on Patent Laws, and I know the kind of service of Mr. B.K. Kela, he died 3 years ago. But I think it has played an enormous role in sensitizing people. So when the moment was there, then all this critical energy, which was all this critique, which was there in the environment, that was, retrieved and brought to bear on these two decisions. So we require, I think, movements require enormous patience. Meera Patkar has been at it for what, 3 decades now? 2 or 3 decades have gone by. She's not successful. The media is not paying any attention to her fast. She's fasting. I don't know what day of her fasting. Has she ended her fast? Does anybody know? I don't know. So that's the role of the media. I think she's still on fast. So that's the state. So how academics can. So why is it that social movements do not find a place in our academic work as seriously as it should? But not separately. That was my point. What happens is some of us do social movements. We are the social movement types. They call the Jhola wala types. They social movement karte hain. Ye academics karte hain. So what we want is that we need these two narratives to be integrated. That these are not two separate worlds. And that is that resistance is part of the normal process of doing good academics. It is not a separate undertaking which some of us undertake because we are specialized. Then it's all about niche. You are specialized in social movement. I've written a thesis on social movements. I've written a book on social movement. Then the marginalization of that is ensured. But you have to bring it. This is what feminist scholarship did. So this is not a new strategy. So the strategy of mainstreaming is very, very important. We can learn our lessons from feminist scholars, from women's movement. They have successfully been able to do so. So that is what I feel should be the role of academics and academic movement. But I think that requires a larger discussion on the role of intellectuals, in general.
Hegelian, actually. In the way, right, literally, at least I walked in a little late, you've just begun, but it's all about ideas. And your whole argument is that ideas shape the world. And then really, ideas ultimately manifest themselves very physically. And from those smart mathematical kids who are building all these derivatives, total abstractions are ultimately having a manifest physical output. So I actually found I found your talk fantastic. I think I speak for the audience, but at least that's my assessment. But here's the serious question: the intellectual agenda you're setting forth is an incredibly exciting one, because it's taking on a critical perspective. You're clearly arguing that we need to have an emancipatory cognitive interest here. A very, very clear understanding that we're going to get out of, a whole bunch of these subterranean elements that exist. My question is this: why is nobody doing it? If it is as you say it is, and it is self-evidently exciting, it's more exciting than a lot of the other work that we collectively do, then it does beg that question, which is, why is it that so little of it is being done? And I'd really like you to sort of reflect on that and tell us from your point of view. I've heard you talking about similar things for quite some time now. But why is it that it ultimately, it just doesn't happen?
Yeah, no. I think that's a difficult and a complex question. But so one is that, speaking at a very general level, is critique happening of the kind that I've been talking about? Are there organic intellectuals linked to, say, working class movements, linked to real people's movements, etc., etc.? Yes, I certainly feel there are a lot of which is actually happening. Remember that when 1989 happened, and when Fukuyama wrote that banal thesis, it seems banal only in hindsight. I mean, he was celebrated for making this whole thesis on the end of history. Some people truly believed in 1889 that there's only one way to salvation, you know. But we are just 2 decades. So in historical time, this is almost nothing at all. But within 2 decades, you are seeing resistance movements all over the world. You are seeing a completely new set of governments voted to power in Latin America. In fact, I think a lot of thinking around the critical project in policy terms is happening in Latin America. There is the World Social Forum which cropped up, which is mobilizing sort of social movements, critical thought from around the world. So if you actually see what has happened in the last 2.5 decades, there's a lot of critical energy out there, which could not have been foreseen in '89. People thought all alternatives have collapsed. But now we think that is banal. So one, it is happening. The second issue is, why isn't it happening in the discipline of international relations? And I think there we require a lot more self-reflection. And my own hunch is a couple of things. One is the history of the discipline itself. The history of the discipline itself, that this discipline arose in the Western world. In some ways, it was intimately related to the colonial or hegemonic project, and we have not sufficiently contested that. We have not still sufficiently contested that project. Second is this sort of the self understanding of the role of the expert in international relations, which is less to do with the critical project than to be a perceived, at least understanding in some sections, that it is to advise policymakers about what alternative options that they have, which I do not rule out. So my own sense is that we need to do both. So I do not suggest that, I'm not suggesting that we only pursue some kind of critical project which is all about negatives. You didn't do this right, you didn't do that, you didn't do that. But we also, of course, need a reconstructive agenda which follows the critical project, where we can tell. So we can tell this person who in the government, please amend the IPR law. Now you have seen the outcome, please change it. The third is that mainstream social science historically has been linked to anti-capitalist movements. So that is the historical detail, that mainstream social sciences accompany the rise of capitalism. They didn't exist in this disciplinary form prior to the rise of capitalism. But since they rose with capitalism, they also reflected on the contradictions of capitalism. So, and that contradictions are reflected even in the founding figures. So if you read Adam Smith, he also is reflecting. Some of the great critique of capitalism comes from Adam Smith, and some of the most celebrated celebrations of capitalism comes from Marx's writings. But so the point that I'm trying to make is that they accompanied each other together. But international relations as a discipline, this did not happen. I think it is this intimate relationship to the colonial project that stopped this from us reflecting on essential categories like capitalism itself, and also in being able to have a self-reflective critical project. So if you look at, and I was reading, I don't know if I'm going to bore the others, but recently I read an essay which I didn't know you teach the course with, how the whole realist project was invented in 1950s in the United States. How Kenneth Thompson was in the Rockefeller Foundation. How Kenneth Thompson actually assembled including his Guru Morgenthau, assembled 20 people in a room, put them together and said, now tell us what the best way of doing IR is. And they came up with these ideas and they came up with this strategy, and the cast of characters that were present in that. And now you have the verbatim record, the transcripts of the proceedings. So that project, I don't think we have sufficiently contested, because that was always the hegemonic. Finally, I would say the reason we have not is that I think, and this we have talked about several times, I know, that I think the non-Western thinking has not been sufficiently retrieved. So we do not really have an alternative theoretical paradigm. And by non-Western thinking, I don't mean nativist thinking. All what I have in mind is what I mentioned is the kind of arguments that Dipesh Chakravarti makes about provincializing Europe, that Europe is not any longer center stage. There is no longer only one kind of modernity. There are alternative or multiple modernities. Now, if there are alternative modernities and multiple modernities, what kind of international relation should accompany alternative modernities and multiple modernities? We have not really reflected on that. So the moment we think of non-Western thinking, we turn nativist. So it's something, recover something that was said 2 millennia ago. That seems to be non-Western thinking. But I go along with this post-colonial view of the Dipesh Chakravartis and the Partha Chatterjees, that what we need to do really is to find our own life, of how we are living, how we are doing things, and what kind of theory captures it, best. So that critique is also not happening in the sphere of IR. So these are just sort of very, very general reflections. I think we need much longer thinking on this. But otherwise we would reach an impasse, because why is it that every time something really big happens, until Said was, I would immediately go to Chomsky's blog and Said's blog. Today I go to Richard Flock's blog. What do they say? What's happening? So why don't we have somebody who is able to guide us about how our own thinking should be, how we should be shaping the world rather than be shaped by it. But Varun, you know this better than I do. You have been thinking on these issues for long. That there are no ready answers to this. But we need to ask the right questions, and I think we are not asking the right questions. How does the IFIs bridge the political economic divide without your empowering the IFIs in ways that you do not wish to? Because by saying that you can be political, you allow them to do things which you really don't want them to do. That is, discriminate between countries that they subscribe, that they lend to, at least in the case of the World Bank. So 2-3 things. First, of course, this divide was not really the East-West divide. This was Keynes's thinking. You see, Keynes and White were the key figures in the making, as if it were, of the Bretton Woods institutions. And Keynes was insistence that all lending done, especially by the IMF, should be automatic lending, and so should the World Bank to Western Europe. So he didn't want any conditionality. That is, as we know, the reason why the word still doesn't exist. That they had to amend the mandate of both the World Bank and the IMF in order to bring conditionalities in. And so that was the reason that Keynes insisted this divide. Now, how do you bridge that divide? So my sort of thinking is the following: that they need to keep to the economic so far as taking decisions to lend is concerned. So if somebody comes to the IMF or the World Bank and say, I want your money, then they need to stick to the economic criteria. That is, they don't take into account political criteria, although we all know that if the US doesn't want to lend to you, the IMF, World Bank won't lend to you. And that is why they say the UN security, so would they lend to Iran? They wouldn't. So we know they are political, but I would still say that only economic criteria. But politics so far as the outcomes are concerned. So at the other end, they must be political, and they have partially accepted it, but they won't admit it. For example, to give you an example, the World Bank has created the World Bank Inspection Panel. We know that. And what is the World Bank Inspection Panel? Basically this, that I have given you a project, my internal guidelines so far as environmental standards, human rights are not being respected. And therefore you can come to me, to the World Bank Inspection Panel, and say, look, the project guidelines are not being observed, therefore stop giving a loan to, stop giving the next phase of the loan. So they have accepted, but they won't verbally, they won't accept it in terms of articulating it, because their fear is that that would be admitting that actually the international financial institution policies, have led to gross violation, of human rights. Once they admit that, the second thing that will happen is, and this is something a lot of people are writing, that ECOSOC needs to redefine its relationship with financial institutions. That is, ECOSOC needs to assert itself and say that they have, an agreement with specialized agencies. And it's that agreement which gives autonomy to the financial institutions. So if they admit that there is human rights violations, gross wrongs have been done, then the ECOSOC would be much more well placed to make these arguments, let's redefine our relationship, and that autonomy that we gave you in 1947, we need to retrieve that autonomy. So a lot is at stake in making that admission. But in practice they try. We know they have co-opted green, they have co-opted gender, they have co-opted development, they have even co-opted the state. They say, oh, state is the great actor. So they are adept at doing that. But they won't admit it. So I think we can have an economic and political mix, which is not, as you say, a double-edged sword. Although, of course, there would be elements of risk in that. Now, how do social movements what is the potential of their critique? I think the critique that, you see, where we have been let down, there are two things. One is that social movements globally are not united enough, or do not have the sort of counter power, if you want to put it crudely, to shape policies. But what the counter narrative has done is to bring all the key variables on the table. Where we have been let down is by the leaders of, and we shouldn't expect it, but I still continue to expect, by the leadership of, in this case, of the third world. Let's just give you an example. In 2008, admittedly the greatest economic crisis of the last century. They said this is once in a century crisis. The economies of the first world were on their knees. Europe continues to be. Greece is devastated. Spain and Italy are in serious problems. What do we do? Look at what do we do. What do the BRICS countries do, for example? We happily want a photo opportunity with G20. All they have to say is be part of the big boys. All they say, be part of the big boys. Go, come and join us. You will have a voice also. You will shape it. They initially even promised that you'll get some more votes in the IMF, which still fully not realized. How much more votes? Yes, they have. China has been more successful. They now have a deputy, whatever, president of the World Bank or something. So where did we get? In 1970s, when the crisis was much, the scale was not of this order at all. We said NIO, New International Economic Order. What did we do this time? Here was an opportunity for these countries, especially when China and India knew that the world economy cannot get out of its crisis but for us. They are riding our growth rates, if you want to talk about growth rates, in order to move towards recovery. We did not do enough. We did not articulate an alternative vision. Unfortunately, even Brazil didn't, which is doing it for itself. both at domestic level, whether you take its participatory budgeting in, whether you take its views towards investment, whether you take its views towards trade, it is doing it. But when it came to articulating at a global stage, for some reason it abstained. We did not do so, which is sad, and that is where giving up on the non-aligned movement has been so, such a setback. We could have really said, here is an alternative vision. Do you want to be part of this? We may not have got it accepted. I think that's where the social movements and the academic critics felt very let down. And then sometimes I feel poor old Morgenthau was right. That poor guy, this guy, we keep critiquing him endlessly, but somewhere he got it right. It's all about, what do states want in international politics? Power. Why do they want power? Nothing else, but for the sake of power. So it's in the same way there is the accumulation of capital. Why does the monies need more capital? Sometimes people say, oh, sab kuch to hai, ab kya karenge? No, that's the logic of accumulation. Also, there is the logic of accumulation of power within states. And somewhere I think he got it right. Because whenever these moments come, we are let down. The other left critique is that is the nature of the state. So the left critique would be that is the nature of this ruling class and the states in these countries. And therefore they did not want to give an alternative vision. Because by all stretch of imagination, China is not pursuing anything remotely called socialism. So why do you expect it to stand up? The only one I felt let down by is India and Brazil. I think these two countries should have articulated. So the point is simply that the social movements have successfully put all these issues in the agenda. They have said that there is an alternative world, that there is this world that is possible, that is realizable. But we movements cannot do it. You have to join us. And our the leadership of the developing world has the same aspirations as the first world has. So what do you want to become? You want to become this. Sometimes I ask, why do you want to become like the US? Do you want to do this to other countries? But frankly, like I said, for a moment I have these lapses. I feel, oh, this guy had got it. Somewhere he understood better than us. And we all know Morgenthau understood Marxism very well. He was part of the Frankfurt School for 1 year. He understood, unlike the neo-realists who are vulgar and banal, he understood history. So somewhere he got it right, maybe. But this is a weak moment, so don't quote this back to me.